no, please.
Yeah. No, but we said we would have to do it. So I mentioned in the last segment that we were going to come on to discuss gender. And as mentioned at the top of the show,
please,
Judith Butler has written...
Oh, anyone but Judith Butler.
It's written a really long and mad essay in The Guardian, typically. Why is the idea of gender provoking a backlash the world over, says Judith Butler, who should perhaps look in a mirror.
There ought to be a safe space in the world just for me where I can go and hide from the writings of Judith Butler. As someone who studied philosophy,
yes, well, she's a visiting professor of philosophy now at the New School or something.
She's
I don't know why
distinguished professor, apparently.
Distinguished by what? Anyway, so she's written this essay in The Guardian, which is very long and we can't go through all of it, but just to give a flavour, it's a little bit like, well, it's Judith Butler bingo, basically, or Guardian bingo, because in this long essay about why people are starting to question gender ideologues like Judith Butler, things like neoliberalism are mentioned, fascism is mentioned, there's the obligatory attacks on Poland and Hungary. She says, in June, the Hungarian parliament voted overwhelmingly to eliminate from public schools all teaching related to homosexuality and gender change, associating LGBTQI rights and education. Where's the plus in that?
Also, what does the I mean again?
I don't know. It might be intersex. Sometimes that's a thing. Despite the fact that intersex people don't actually exist. Intersex is a broad label, meaning it encompasses 40 different conditions which are experienced by virtually no one in the grand scheme of things.
They're very uncommon, aren't
Very
they?
uncommon things. And the reason they're designated as such is precisely because they're so uncommon, they need a separate label. There's the idea that their existence ought to explode the idea of a gender binary is flatly... It's an exception that proves the rule, but anyway... So yeah, they associate, apparently, Hungarians associate LGBTQI rights and education with paedophilia and totalitarian cultural politics, and on the latter of which I can see why. In late May, Danish MPs passed a resolution against excessive activism in academic research environments, which I think we'd probably both agree is a damn good idea.
I'm all for being against excessive activism.
Excessive activism is a really good way of describing them as well, people like Judith Butler.
Also, she's comparing Hungary to Denmark.
Well, I didn't. The Denmark, the Danes aren't usually associated with fascist cultural trends. Normally, the left loves the Scandies.
Well, she's picking on them because they're quite homogeneous, aren't they? It's just they lack a slightly, an ever so slightly lunatic religious leader.
I mean, the Danes, in their good sense, have included as excessive activism, apparently, gender studies, race theory, post-colonial and immigration studies, all of which exist because of excessive activism. That's what they're for. They don't do anything else. Why we continue to fund them is a mystery to me. She says, in December 2020, the Supreme Court in Romania struck down a law that would have forbidden the teaching of gender identity theory, but the debate there rages on. Trans-free spaces in Poland have been declared by transphobes eager to purify Poland of corrosive cultural influences from the US and the UK. And Turkey's withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention, which must be very awkward, in March sent shudders through the EU, since one of its main objections was the inclusion of protections for women and children against violence, and this problem was linked to the foreign word gender.
I very much doubt that is the first thing that went through the leaders of the EU's minds. Oh, damn it! Now we can't impose this ideology on Turkey.
And no,
Might
but
have
also
had a bit more to do with trade and immigration and cheap labour and all
possibly something to do with that, but also it's not immediately clear from Judith Butler's argument exactly what form those objections took. If they were couched in the language of gender, in what way were they couched in the language of gender?
Because I should caveat all of this by saying that I do genuinely think that elements of, for example, Poland and Hungary's attitudes to what you might call the LGBT community is worrying. Because I think that, I am myself religious, but Catholic Poland is quite an authoritarian country, at least compared to modern-day Britain.
Yeah, and there are authoritarian trends in Hungary, but we were discussing this last night. I mean, the problem is that the LGBTQI movement that Judith Butler cites as though it was coterminous with the mere existence of gay people is itself making lives for trans people and gay people more difficult because it is going to these bizarre extremes, the kind of extremes that Judith Butler, for instance, supports. The idea that gender actually is predominant and there are multiple of them. Yeah, so the arguments from people like Judith Butler who do take gender to these bizarre extremes, there are innumerable genders, all of which not only need, but deserve, not only deserve, but must have government A, recognition, B, protection, over and above the rights of people who object to this kind of thing, makes it very, very much easier for supposedly or quasi-authoritarian governments in Poland and in Hungary, for instance, to turn around and say, look what's happening over in America, look what's happening over in the United Kingdom. They think that people can be two-spirit or genderqueer or dragonkin. They can be dolls if they want to. That awful TikTok video that we watched, which I'll have to put up on screen at some point. It's very much easier for them to attack this, and also the basic claims that trans people might make, the right just to be ignored as far as is possible by the rest of society. It's easier for them to attack these sensible propositions by reference to the insensible propositions that people like Judith Butler support.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm friends with a number of trans people, and that's not just, oh yeah, I have a black friend. I genuinely am friends with a lot of trans people, and well, none of them are young, so maybe that's it, but they're all very, very politically incorrect. They don't really have much time for the sort of activistic class that's arisen beneath them. The sort of old school, like the original Stonewall gays, as opposed to the new irritating gays.
Yeah, well, the original Stonewall gays are the ones who found, for instance, the LGB Alliance, and a lot of them have disavowed Stonewall as it now is, precisely because they see the erosion of their own rights as being threatened by the LGBTQI movement. I mean, Judith Butler in this piece says, although, and again I mentioned it's bingo at the beginning, so declare full house when you get to the end, although nationalist, transphobic, misogynist and homophobic, the principal aim of the movement is to reverse progressive legislation won in the last decades by both LGBTQI and feminist movements. I wasn't aware the LGBTQI movement was decades old, because the Q and the I are relatively recent accretions as far as I am aware. But indeed, in attacking gender, they oppose reproductive freedom for women, the rights of single parents, they oppose protections for women against rape and domestic violence, and they deny the legal and social rights of trans people along with a full array of legal and institutional safeguards against gender discrimination, forced psychiatric internment, brutal physical harassment and killing. All is further ramped up during a pandemic time, which domestic abuse has soared, and queer and trans kids have been deprived of their spaces for gathering in a
forced psychiatric internment. I wasn't aware that was still going on.
No, or maybe it is in Hungary and we just haven't heard about it. But I mean, there's an immediate problem there, which is that they are removing, apparently the Hungarians and their ilk are trying to remove the rights of women to be safe from male violence, at the same time as the LGBTQI movement, which Judith Butler is supporting in this piece, is arguing for men to be allowed into women's only spaces, including places where women are particularly vulnerable, like prisons, swimming pools and the like, on the grounds of opposing transphobia. And we know from studies that there is a demonstrably higher rate of sexual predation amongst men who declare themselves women than there is amongst women generally. I mean, I think it was in Sweden did a study which found that the rates of domestic abuse and the rates of child sexual abuse, which previously were heavily weighted toward men, for some reason at around the year 2010, completely shifted, and all of a sudden women were equally represented, or almost equally represented in the statistics, which meant a marked rise in the rates of women accused of fiddling with kids, essentially. It just so happens that this change in thing followed a change in the law, which said that self-ID is the one you go with. So most of the women doing the abusing to, bravely push up women's rates of domestic abuse perpetration were in fact not women. They were people who had declared themselves to be women. The right to have a sex-only space, you can debate that right, but Judith Butler seems to be having it both ways in saying that on the one hand we're trying to, the Polish and the Hungarian governments are trying to do away with female protections. On the other hand, we want this policy that is demonstrably making women less safe. There is this unfortunate conflict between some forms of trans activism and the rights of women, because the trans activists don't effectively believe that woman is an immutable category that should be protected. It's something you can declare yourself into if you feel that way. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the Stephen Nolan's podcast on Stonewall yet.
No.
It's well worth listening to, in part because he gets the chief editor of Pink News on and asks him a few questions about some of the things he's hearing, like, for instance, what two-spirit is. And the editor-in-chief of Pink News doesn't know what two-spirit is. I don't know what Two-Spirit is. Nobody really knows what Two-Spirit is. It's complete nonsense.
And why Two-Spirit? Isn't that kind of, regressive? Why not Ten-Spirit?
Well, I think that from what I vaguely recall reading, it has some kind of claim as origin for the Inuit peoples or the Aboriginals of America.
Oh, yeah, because they're all swanning about in huge numbers.
But as long as you feel that way, the overwhelming impression you get is that when he speaks to critics of the LGBTQI movement, who are most of them gay themselves, they are by and large scientists and social psychologists and clinical psychologists who will talk in the language of science, and who will talk in the language of evolution, and of immutable characteristics like sex and what constitutes these things. Everyone Stephen Nolan interviews from the other side, the pro-LGBTAIQ+ side, like the editor-in-chief of Pink News, and the trans mayor of Sheffield, is it, I think, at the moment, or Cardiff or somewhere horrible. They all talk in terms about their feeling. It's what you feel like in that particular day. There's no attempt to actually ground it in something which is real. There's no attempt to
They don't feel
ground it
the
in
need
basis
to, you
of
see,
science.
because they've already begun the work of deconstructing the possibility of empirical truths. We saw this, I think last year, was it, when the whole when Orwell came true, basically 1984 came true, and people, in some cases actual teachers and professors, started genuinely debating whether 2 + 2 did equal 4. So they've already mounted this, started mounting this attack against the edifice of empirical knowledge and the possibility of science. E = mc² was at some point accused of being colonialist or some nonsense like that, which is ironic, of course, because it's a theory of relativity.
There was a story out today, actually, that some school board in America has been inviting lecturers in to talk about the sins of white empiricism in the sciences. Which is just that's a whole other topic, but on this point, actually, there's Helen Joyce's book, which I have with me. I'm reading at the moment. I think it's Helen Joyce's book. It's called Trans, which takes a critical look at this movement, not again against trans people. It's annoying that you have to keep stressing this in these conversations, but neither of us is against trans people.
Well, Dave Chappelle, it didn't matter how many times he'd stressed that, he was still cancelled. And actually, just briefly, when I was watching the closer, it's almost as if he knew that this show would have him roundly condemned and cancelled more than he'd ever been. Because he kept sort of dropping hints like, this is my last show, I'm not going to speak about this stuff again, I'm going all the way, folks. Like, he knew what was coming, but he did it anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right, it is depressing that people like you and me who, it's not really our place to judge these things, is it? But presumably you and I would both consider ourselves respectively to be, compassionate and sympathetic people. It's depressing that people like you and I and just ordinary people the country over feel the need to keep saying we don't actually hate trans people, we don't actually hate anyone.
No, and in fact, I mean, couched it earlier in the language of the danger that's being done to trans people as well by militant trans activists. It ought really, if we are treated charitably, to be considered an attempt to protect trans people against the excesses of the trans movement. Of course, they're capable of protecting themselves as they wish to. Some of the trans women in particular have a definitively a male proclivity to violence and self-defense, which we will not deny them.
Well, it takes a lot of courage to decide that you're going to present to society as the gender that you were not assigned at birth. I mean, I couldn't do it, and I admire anyone who.
But I suppose you haven't got the inclination to do it, and that's one of the many points about the point at which gender dysphoria does it in fact diverge from what we now consider to be trans. Is trans and more. But these are all.
For my own part, I think there is undoubtedly. Because I think there's got to be some sort of scientific basis for why certain people feel and identify as transgender. The thing I think that's happened is that many people, particularly the young and the vulnerable, who are preyed upon by adults who should know better, are convinced that they also feel this way before they reach the age at which they could possibly know this. So there is, as it were, genuine transgender people, and there are huge numbers of people who either identify as allies of transgender people without actually knowing that much about it, or maybe even knowing that many transgender people, and on the other hand, huge numbers of people who identify as trans who are not in fact trans. They are incredibly confused, and they don't do genuine trans people any favours.
No, that was the guy who Stephen Nolan interviewed, whose name I forget, the professor formerly of the Tavistock Clinic, I think it was. They attempted to silence him because he was whistleblowing effectively about some of these, and it comes out in Helen Joyce's book as well, which it charts the origins of the trans movement, and transgenderism as a concept anyway. I mean, typically it begins in sort of Weimar Germany with eccentric German sexologists, because all of these bad ideas come from, if they don't come from France, they come from eccentric German sexologists. That's usually the rule. Charts it forward, and even to this day, that the World Institute for the Protection of Transgender Health, is it? I can't remember if that's the actual name. It was born out of an organisation founded by a guy who learned from this particular German, another German called Hamburger, who was an actual, I think he was a convicted fraudster. Nevertheless, the movement is born from him, and she goes through some of the things that you've just discussed, and what the professor's name, who I forget his name annoyingly, but in Stephen Nolan's podcast discusses, which is the number of people, the confluence between people who present at very young ages as gender non-conforming, say, and later diagnoses or procedures to confirm one as trans, and in a vast majority of cases, if left to their own devices, kids who are gender non-conforming when they're very young I forget the exact statistic, but the vast majority of cases just grow up to be gay. That's it. There's nothing more complicated than that. And the early cases in the 50s and 60s that Helen Joyce talks about were almost certainly the same. And these are people very uncomfortable with their own perceived gender roles, and uncomfortable with their sexual relations or sexual proclivities, and sought, therefore, to get some fundamental change on the basis of nonsense. I mean, this guy who it's another H, not Hamburger, the guy who preceded him, who starts this movement off, really, and does so with absolutely no reference to what we understand the nature of sex to be since the age of Darwin. He proceeds as though that never happened, and on the basis which the modern transgender movement continues to uphold, which is that there is, everyone is in part bisexual, and bisexual we don't mean in terms of sexuality. Bisexual is in everybody has a bit of both gender in them. And it might be, I think one of the quotes from the guy who found it says, nobody can be more than 80% the gender that they are. There's always a bit. And so people who feel that they're in the wrong bodies just have an imbalance of this, and that can be corrected via hormones and via surgery and things like that. But
that doesn't mean anything, does it? Because all that amounts to saying is that some part of your behaviour is, it crosses over, if you imagine like a Venn diagram, crosses over with the typical behaviour of the opposite sex.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that 20% of you is just a woman. It's not how these things
work. But it evolved after Hamburger to being that. So effectively, this is the subsequent almost sort of pre-postmodernist move. So this is the late 50s. I think this came out. The idea that actually, your sex as you feel it is set after birth, based on what you are socialised into. So it's the early argument from sociology. Whatever stereotypical behaviours you are encouraged to take will in fact be the ones you're comfortable with.
We know that's not true.
We know that's not true, but we also know the fact that the earlier contention, which is that everybody is bisexual in that scientific sense, is complete bunk, because it's counter Darwin. Mammals are sexually dimorphic. There is no gender fluidity. There are some species like clownfish and alligators, and some species of frog that are either hermaphroditic or can transition between sexes based on external stimuli.
I think we are not
capable of that. No, that was in Michael Crichton, and that was because they used frog DNA.
Okay,
but maybe they were. But good film. But we are not notably ourselves reptiles or fish, and we are mammals. And
mammals, I don't know. I look at some people.
The Queen, for instance, is famously a lizard.
Oh yes, according to David.
But anyway, this later argument goes on, which is that actually, what you're socialised into, the stereotypical roles you're socialised into, are the ones that form your entire gender conception. So there's a really famous case of two twins who they were born with minutes apart from each other, and in the process of having them circumcised, that typically weird American tradition, the tool being used to circumcise the older of the two twins had an electrical fault, overheated, and basically burnt the kid's penis off. And they fell under, I think it was Hamburger's sway, the parents, and he told them that, okay, well, the best solution for this is to bring the kid up as though he was a girl. So we just get rid of the rest of the penis, the charred stump that remained, and graft a little bit on to make it seem a bit more like a neo-vagina. And bring him up as a girl. He won't ever know that he's not. He'll think he is a girl, and they'll be fine. That's problem solved. And this lesson was taken by thousands of people in similar situations. The twin who grew up having had this done to him at a very early age started saying, "No, I'm a boy. I am a boy. I feel like a boy. I'm a boy. I want to wear boy clothes. I want to do boys things," despite having been brought up as a girl. And eventually...
So evidently the scrotum was unscathed.
Well, the psychological scrotum was unscathed. But it also refuted the idea, which is still prevalent, which is that your gender roles are purely determined by the thing into which you are socialised, which is something that Judith Butler, I think, does support, to go back to her. That kid ended up committing suicide, I think, as many did, because they were subjected to a very crude experiment with no scientific basis, which denied the existing body of scientific knowledge. And an awful lot of harm was done to thousands of people because of that. The scary thing is, very little of that's actually changed in the years since. So the LGBTIQA plus ideology, which promotes a particularly radical form of trans activism, actually repeats verbatim, without any significant change or any change at all, a lot of the lessons that were debunked in the 1950s and the 1960s about what constitutes gender, where gender comes from, and how one is socialised into it. And the results are that you get the Tavistock Clinic and the Gids Identity Change Clinic. I think this one deserves a bit more time. The Gids Identity Clinic as well, which are having very young kids referred to them, and prescribes life-changing drugs which do have irreversible consequences, though a lot of people lie and say that they don't, as though taking puberty blockers for God knows how long has no lasting effect. It does. And this is the immediate response to children who claim to be gender non-conforming when they're very young. If they just were left to their own devices, they would grow up to be gay. And it's a problem that some older pre-Stonewall type gays have, which is that actually this does represent a kind of threat to being gay, because it's preferable for a lot of parents in a lot of communities. Iran, for instance, has the highest rate of transgender surgeries of any country in the world, and another Islamic majority country is the same. I can't remember which one it is.
I'm undecided on puberty blockers at the moment, by the way. Obviously, I don't advocate giving puberty blockers to children as young as 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever. But the recent sort of court case about that, what was that? What was the specificities of that again? Was it whether it was whether it should be legal to give puberty blockers to people under the age of 18, I think it was, or 16.
Yeah, I think it was under 16. I'd want to look that up.
The argument I've heard, which seems to me a fairly good argument, is that you should be allowed to give them at a slightly younger age than is currently the law, because if you take puberty blockers, thereby blocking your puberty, and you reach a certain age and you decide, actually, I'm not trans, I made a mistake, blah blah blah, all you have to do is stop taking them, and your normal puberty will sort of come back, and you'll undergo that
you've
as
had
per usual.
Permanent bodily changes that have been, like body shape changes, for instance, because of the way puberty goes through.
But the second part of the argument is, if you were not allowed to take the puberty blockers, and you waited and you went through your natural puberty and you went through similarly reversible changes, naturally occurring, obviously, but decided, no, I really am trans, then it's much more difficult for you than it might otherwise have been had you taken the puberty blockers to transition. So I can see that argument.
Yes, but I can also see the argument that it should be bloody difficult to transition.
Well, of course, it's never going to be easy, is it? But
I
just thought it was a fairly respectable
What
argument.
I mean by it should be difficult is that we know that a large number of people, if left to their own devices, unmolested by the intrusions of scientists who are basing their ideas on debunked theories from the 1950s, if you leave them be, they will grow up and they will be gay. And then most children grow out of gender dysphoria and gender nonconformity, and by and large go on to be same-sex attracted, but then they're fine after that point. The problem with intervening medically at an early stage is that you don't allow that natural process to take through. That's really that's where the danger comes in, because if
so
you left
it's a utilitarian argument, essentially.
Well, it's partly a utilitarian argument. It's certainly a consequentialist argument, but it's also an argument for a bit of caution. When I say it should be difficult to transition, I mean that because the present case, the law judge, the court of law initially said no, you are no longer allowed to apply puberty blockers, for instance, to children under 16 without judicial review of that process, which was very, very, very strictly in the other direction. Effectively, that would have said, no, you just can't do it. It's so costly and time-consuming to do it. The Court of Appeal ruled against that, but only in half of it, so that they ruled that, no, okay, you don't have to get judicial review before prescribing puberty blockers to children under 16, but the doctors must, by law now, take account of the individual child's ability to grasp the long-term consequences of their decision, which can include sterility, permanent bodily changes, which are long-term consequences, which puberty blockers do unfortunately have, and are irreversible. I to be honest, I would have been actually more comfortable with the initial court ruling, because I think it ought to be very, very difficult. And now it might be very tough for trans people to hear that, and much more difficult for them to transition, as you say, later in life. But you've got to weigh against that. The trade-off is that if you make it very easy for the few genuine trans people to transition as early as they would have wanted to, with hindsight, you're also establishing a system in which ignorant parents, for instance, or schools, which are increasingly being encouraged in Scotland, for instance, schools are being encouraged to refer children to transgender clinics without informing the parents if the child is demonstrating gender nonconformity in the classroom. And the doctor can prescribe puberty blockers without the consent of the parents.
And Judith
at a
Butler,
very young age.
Judith Butler says in her piece...
And she wonders why there's a reaction against this. Yeah.
Well, she said specifically that Conservatives are saying that this is undermining the sort of integrity of the family.
She does, yeah, she comes on to say
because it is.
Well, it is. I mean, but it's not good for anyone. It's not good for children generally, and that includes trans kids, gay kids, lesbian kids, bisexual kids, or just a bit, weird kids, to have permanent medical changes foisted upon them by people who are unaccountable, without the consent of parents, and at such an early stage that they've not had time to grow out of it. When I was, 4 years old, I thought I was a kestrel. But
you are a kestrel. Kestral's medieval.
It actually meant wind fucker, didn't it? Yes, I am a wind fucker, that's true. But if at the age of 4 years old, I went to some transhumanist clinic and they grafted wings onto me, which I could never remove for the rest of my life, and gave me the ability to lay eggs rather than have a penis. That's
awesome.
A pretty...
I'd do
that. Yeah.
You could fly.
There's actually a South Park episode where Carl's dad gets turned into a dolphin.
Oh, I thought it was an X-Men concept.
It probably is also an X-Men concept. But it's not good for anyone to have to be able to have such drastic changes made, essentially at the brush of the stroke of a pen, without any meaningful oversight. And for particularly vulnerable people, which are kids going through difficult times, either pre-puberty or during puberty, when everyone goes through a kind of difficult time, but gay kids in particular go through a very difficult time. And if you just do what the Iranians do, which is what Judith Butler wants to do, and apparently critics of that are the fascists, she comes on to say that this is effectively a form of fascism. Bingo. And then, who is really the progressive one here? Is it the person who's trying to medicate gayness out of society? Or is it the person who says, okay, trans people absolutely have the right to exist, we should give them all the support we possibly can, but support also includes making things difficult where they need to be difficult in order to ensure the safety and the security of the person going through the procedure?
Well, to bring it all full circle, Judith Butler is herself non-binary.
Is she?
Yeah, she identifies as non-binary.
Oh.
I think. She doesn't identify as a woman, I know that much. But she doesn't look like one either, so...
Yeah, well, I wasn't going to go there, but since you did... No, well, I think, she talks about the vanishing world of social services under neoliberalism, again, bingo. That's what threatens the family.
I've never heard a good definition of neoliberalism. What does it mean?
It means not liberalism. Neo, as in neoconservative, just in practical parlance, means non. In fact, it doesn't. Neoliberalism is a very specific kind of... It was supposed to be a very specific economic doctrine of around sort of the 70s and 80s associated with Milton Friedman and Hayek. But now it's a sound economic doctrine. Now is a catch-all term for any kind of third-way Blairite style actual massive state involvement, but just hiding under the... That's another topic. But is there anything else worth mentioning about Judith Butler before we move on? She calls it fascist, blames neoliberalism for the decline of families. Anti-gender movements are not just reactionary, but fascist trends. The kind that support increasingly authoritarian governments. The inconsistency of their arguments and their equal opportunity approach to rhetorical strategies of the left and right produce a confusing discourse for some, Judith Butler would know, a compelling one for others, but they are typical of fascist movements that twist rationality to suit hyper-nationalist aims. So we have, in the course of this podcast, declared ourselves to be fascists, hyper-nationalists, and at the same time neoliberals. And yeah, I mean, it's sort of hard to keep track, but it's Judith Butler, isn't it? So it's always hard to keep track. Well, yeah, what is that? There was that fantastic example of her bad writing. Did she win a prize for bad writing?
She won a prize for bad writing, yes. Bad, what's it called? Judith Butler bad writing contest. Get this up on the screen. So this is what Judith Butler had to say in further reflections on the conversations of our time.
And it's one sentence.
An article in the scholarly journal Diacritics, 1997. Diacritics, more like. The move from a structuralist account in which capital is understood to structure social relations in relatively homologous ways to a view of hegemony in which power relations are subject to repetition, convergence, and rearticulation brought the question of temporality, obviously, into the thinking of structure and marked a shift from a form of Althusserian theory that takes structural totalities as theoretical objects to one in which the insights into the contingent possibility of structure inaugurate a renewed conception of hegemony as bound up with the contingent sites and strategies of the rearticulation of power.
I think we can sum that up as bollocks and move on.